The security guard grabbed her wrist so hard the milk carton fell and burst open on the floor. "I said put it back," he snapped. "You don't have enough money." Maria's twins stood behind her, small hands gripping her coat, watching their mother be humiliated in front of a line of strangers. She had $3.40. She needed $4.60. Nobody in that line moved to help her. Except one man. A man in a plain gray jacket, standing quietly behind her, who had already seen something in her open coin purse that made his hands go cold. A coin that should not exist anymore. He said nothing. Not yet. But that coin was about to destroy 2 families, expose a 26-year-old lie, and change everything Maria thought she knew about the woman who raised her. Daniel Cross was not the kind of billionaire people expected. He didn't wear suits unless a shareholder meeting demanded it. He drove a car that was 8 years old, because his father used to say a man who needs a new car every year is a man who is trying to prove something to people who don't care about him. He kept that lesson even after his father was gone, especially after his father was gone. At 38, Daniel ran Crosswell Logistics, one of the largest shipping and freight companies on the eastern seaboard, a company his father built from a single warehouse and a truck with a cracked windshield. Daniel had inherited the empire, yes, but he had also inherited something heavier, a quiet, gnawing sense that the empire had been built on something he didn't fully understand. He worked 11-hour days not because he needed the money, but because sitting still made him think too much. He signed off on employee healthcare expansions personally. He once spent 4 hours on the phone helping a warehouse worker in Ohio fight an insurance company over his daughter's surgery, and never mentioned it to anyone. His assistant Priya said it best. Mr. Cross helps people the way most men hide affairs. Quietly. And like he's ashamed of getting caught. That evening, Daniel had stopped at a grocery store near his office. Not his usual store, not anywhere close to the neighborhoods he normally passed through. He'd taken a wrong turn after a stressful call with his lawyer about a routine audit request from the board, and instead of turning around, something made him pull into the lot. He would later tell himself it was random. He would later understand it wasn't. He was standing 3 people back in line, phone in his pocket, tie loosened, thinking about numbers on a balance sheet that hadn't matched cleanly in months. A discrepancy so small his own accountants had waved it off as a rounding artifact from decades ago. Daniel hadn't waved it off. Daniel didn't believe in coincidences when it came to money. His father used to say that too, in the rare moments he spoke about the early years of the company at all. That was when he noticed the woman in front of him. She was maybe in her early 30s, thin in a way that spoke of skipped meals rather than diet, wearing a coat with a missing button, holding the hands of 2 small children who kept looking up at the candy display with the kind of hope only 6-year-olds have. Hope that hadn't yet learned to protect itself from disappointment. She placed a single carton of milk on the counter. Her hand went into a small coin purse, counting out change with the careful, practiced motion of someone who had done this exact humiliating math too many times before. Daniel wasn't a man who inserted himself into strangers' business. He genuinely believed, that dignity mattered more than charity. And that charity given loudly wasn't charity at all, it was performance. So he didn't step forward yet. He watched. He always watched before he acted. It was the one trait that had kept Crosswell Logistics profitable through 2 recessions while competitors folded. But then he saw it. Tucked between 2 worn dollar bills in her coin purse was a coin. Small, dull silver, slightly irregular at the edges, the kind of minting flaw that modern currency didn't have anymore. He would have missed it entirely if the light from the overhead fixture hadn't caught it at just the right angle. His chest tightened. It couldn't be. He told himself that immediately, the way people tell themselves a shadow isn't a shape, a sound isn't a footstep. There were only ever 12 of those coins made. In a private engraving run his father had commissioned in the late 90s for a business arrangement Daniel had heard about only once. In fragments, from a lawyer who'd had too much wine at his father's funeral. His father told him all 12 were lost. Gone, along with the woman who once held them. Daniel's eyes moved from the coin to the woman's face. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the cashier with quiet, practiced dread, already preparing the apology she'd have to give her children. He didn't say a word. He simply reached into his own pocket, laid 2 $20 bills on the counter for the cashier, and said only, Whatever she needs, and whatever's behind her too. Before turning and walking out of the store, before the woman could even register what had happened, before she could turn around and see his face, before she could thank him, before she could ask his name. He didn't want to be thanked. He wanted to think. Because if that coin was what he believed it was, then somewhere in this city was the answer to a question his father had refused to answer for 20 years. And a debt Daniel didn't even know his family owed until this exact moment, standing in a grocery store aisle that smelled like bleach and old bread, watching a stranger's hands shake as she counted out coins that weren't enough. He sat in his car in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes afterward, engine off, hands still on the wheel, replaying the half-second glimpse of that coin over and over in his mind, the way a man replays a car accident he isn't sure he actually saw. He told himself there were 1,000 explanations. Reproductions existed. Collectors sometimes commissioned lookalikes of rare mintings for display purposes. He had built an entire career on not jumping to conclusions, on waiting for the second and third data point before he ever trusted the first. But some old animal part of him, the part that had grown up in a house where his father flinched every time a certain decade came up in conversation, already knew. He thought too about how strange it was that he'd never once questioned his father's story as a child. Ruthie had simply stopped visiting. Children accept disappearances the way they accept weather. They don't ask why the rain stopped, only whether it will come back. By the time Daniel was old enough to ask real questions, the habit of not asking had already calcified into something that felt, absurdly, like respect for his father's privacy. He understood now, sitting in a grocery store parking lot at 9 o'clock at night, that it had never been respect at all. It had been fear, inherited the way some children inherit their parents' allergies, without ever being told what caused it. He drove home a different way than usual, taking the long route along the river, in no hurry to arrive anywhere. Because arriving meant walking back into a house with a wife who read his face better than almost anyone alive, and he didn't yet trust himself to keep this discovery hidden from her, even though some instinct he couldn't name yet, told him tonight was not the night to share it. Maria Alvarez had learned, a long time ago, that the world does not slow down to explain itself to poor people. It simply happens to you, and you are expected to keep walking. She was 26 when her husband Tomas left, not dramatically. No fight, no final scene, no slammed door. He simply stopped coming home one Tuesday, and 3 weeks later a folded note arrived saying he needed space to figure things out, as if space were something you could afford when you had 2 6-year-olds and a rent payment due in 9 days. Maria never told her children the truth about why their father left, because she didn't fully understand it herself, and because some truths are too heavy to hand to a child before they're old enough to carry them. She worked 2 jobs. Mornings, she cleaned offices in a business complex downtown, arriving before 6 so she could finish before the twins woke up for school. Afternoons, she took in sewing and alterations for a dry cleaner 3 blocks from her apartment. Hemming pants and replacing zippers with hands that had gone rough and calloused years before they should have. She made just enough most months to keep the lights on and food in the refrigerator. Some months she didn't. Her twins, Sofia and Mateo, didn't know they were poor. Not really, Maria made sure of that. She turned rice and beans into adventure dinners with invented names. She wrapped secondhand toys in newspaper comics on their birthdays and called it extra special paper. She sang to them at night even when her voice cracked from exhaustion, because she remembered, vividly, painfully, a voice that used to sing to her the exact same way, in a different apartment, a lifetime ago. That voice belonged to a woman named Ruth. Maria had grown up in the foster system, bounced between 3 homes before she was placed, at age 9, with a quiet woman who ran a small tailoring shop out of her house. Ruth wasn't warm in an obvious way. She didn't hug easily or say "I love you" the way television mothers did, but she showed up. Every day, without fail, for 8 years Ruth showed up, packed lunches, checked homework, sat outside Maria's door during thunderstorms without ever mentioning she'd heard Maria crying. Ruth had a slight accent Maria could never place, and a jagged scar across her left palm that she said came from a machine that didn't like me very much. And she never elaborated further, no matter how many times young Maria asked. When Maria was 17, Ruth died suddenly of a heart condition nobody knew she had. There was no funeral with family, because Ruth had none that anyone could find. There was no will, no lawyer, no explanation. There was only a small metal tin box that Ruth had kept locked in the bottom drawer of her sewing desk, which she'd once told Maria, in a tone Maria had never heard her use before or since. "If anything happens to me, this is yours. Don't let anyone see what's inside. Don't sell it. Not ever, no matter how much you need to. Promise me." Maria had promised without understanding what she was promising. Inside the box were 12 identical coins, each engraved with strange symbols Maria didn't recognize, and a tiny number stamped on the underside of each one, so small she hadn't noticed it until she was in her 20s, squinting at them under a lamp one lonely night after Tomas left. She never sold them. Even when the twins were sick and the copay wiped out her savings. Even when the landlord threatened eviction 2 winters ago and she'd sat on her bathroom floor at 2 a.m. with the tin box open in her lap, one coin held between her fingers, staring at it like it might tell her what to do. She never sold them, because some fear deeper than hunger told her not to. Ruth had never been afraid of anything in the 8 years Maria knew her. Not illness, not loneliness, not the slow grind of running a failing business alone. But Ruth had been afraid of this, whatever this was. And Maria had inherited that fear along with the coins, without ever inheriting the reason for it. That evening, after the stranger in the gray jacket paid for her groceries and vanished before she could say a single word of thanks, Maria walked home in the cold with Sofia and Matteo swinging her hands between them, laughing about nothing, the way children do when they don't know their mother's heart is pounding for reasons that have nothing to do with gratitude. Because the way that man had looked at her coin purse, just for half a second right before he paid, hadn't looked like curiosity, it had looked like recognition. And in 8 years of carrying Ruth's secret, no stranger had ever looked at her that way before. That night, after the twins had fallen asleep in the room they shared, tangled together in the same twin bed the way they'd slept since they were toddlers, refusing every attempt Maria made to separate them into their own beds, Maria sat on the edge of her own mattress with the tin box open on her lap. She ran her thumb over each coin slowly, the way she did on the hardest nights, the nights when the bills piled higher than her paychecks, the nights when she let herself wonder just for a moment what her life might look like if she broke her promise. She never let herself wonder for long. Ruth's voice was still clear in her memory. Even 8 years gone. Not loud, never loud, but firm in the particular way of someone who has learned that loud voices get ignored and quiet ones, delivered with enough weight, get remembered. Promise me, Maria. Not ever, no matter how much you need to. She had asked Ruth once, maybe a year before she died, why the coins mattered so much. Ruth had been sewing at the time, needle moving in steady, practiced rhythm, and she hadn't looked up when she answered. "Some things," Ruth had said, "are more dangerous when people know you have them than when you don't have anything at all. You understand that yet?" Maria hadn't understood it then. She was 16, and the biggest danger in her life at the time was a chemistry test she hadn't studied for. She understood it a little better now, holding a coin up to her bedside lamp, thinking about the stranger's face in the grocery store, the half-second of recognition that had passed over it, like a shadow crossing water. She didn't know his name. She hadn't even properly seen him, not really, just the gray jacket and the quiet, deliberate way he'd paid and left without waiting to be thanked. But something in her chest, some old inherited instinct passed down from a woman who'd spent 8 years teaching her to be careful without ever explaining what she was being careful of, told her that man was not finished with her yet. She closed the tin box, locked it, and placed it back on the top shelf of her closet, behind a stack of folded blankets, exactly where it had sat for 9 years. Then she lay awake for a long time, listening to the soft, even breathing of her children in the next room, wondering, not for the first time but with a new and unfamiliar urgency, what secret could possibly be dangerous enough that a woman would rather die never having explained it than risk the people she loved knowing the truth. Vanessa Cross was, by every public measure, the perfect wife of a perfect billionaire. She sat on the boards of 2 children's hospitals. She had founded the Whitmore Cross Foundation for Underprivileged Mothers 4 years earlier, a charity that had been featured in 3 glossy magazines for its innovative direct aid model. She wore modest jewelry to galas, modest by billionaire standards, which still meant a single earring could feed a family for a year. Because she understood, better than almost anyone in her social circle, that the appearance of restraint was its own kind of power. She was, in every photograph, smiling. At home, that smile came off the way other women take off shoes at the end of a long day, automatically, without thought, the moment the front door closed. "You're late again," she said to Daniel that evening, not looking up from her laptop when he walked into the study, still in the gray jacket he'd worn to the grocery store. A jacket she noted immediately because Daniel never wore anything that plain to the office. "I had a stop to make," Daniel said. "You had a stop to make," Vanessa repeated, the way she repeated things when she didn't believe them and wanted him to know it without accusing him outright. It was a skill she'd perfected over 9 years of marriage, saying nothing accusatory, while making every word feel like a trap that had already been sprung. Vanessa hadn't always been like this. Or perhaps she had, and Daniel had simply been too infatuated in the early years to notice the calculation underneath the charm. She had come from money that wasn't quite as old as it pretended to be, a family whose fortune had thinned considerably by the time she was in college, enough that she'd learned, early and thoroughly, that being liked was a currency, and being useful was a currency, and love, real unguarded love, was a luxury she decided she couldn't afford to need. She married Daniel 2 years after his father, Richard Cross, passed away. People at the wedding said it was a beautiful match. What almost none of them knew was that Vanessa had, in the final 18 months of Richard Cross's life, become closer to the old man than Daniel ever had, visiting him during his illness under the guise of helping plan the wedding, sitting with him for hours while he was medicated and untethered from his usual caution, listening to an old man's guilt spill out of him the way it does when death gets close enough to make honesty feel like relief. She had never told Daniel what his father confessed to her in those final months. She had, instead, quietly requested copies of certain old shipping ledgers for the Foundation's historical archive, a request nobody questioned because nobody questions a grieving future daughter-in-law who wants to honor a dying man's legacy. She had read those ledgers more carefully than any accountant Crosswell Logistics had ever employed. She understood, long before Daniel ever would, exactly what the company's early fortune had been built on, and exactly who had been erased to build it. She never used that knowledge cruelly, not at first. She used it carefully. A quiet word to Richard Cross in his final year, framed as loyalty, that secured her a seat on the company's charitable board before she'd even married his son. A gentle suggestion, framed as legal caution, that convinced the old man to leave a specific clause in his will regarding any future claims related to historical partnership disputes. A clause that, on paper, looked like standard legal boilerplate, and was in fact a wall Vanessa had built years in advance, around a secret only she and a dying man had known. Tonight, watching Daniel stand in the doorway of the study with a strange, distant look on his face, a look she recognized because she had seen his father wear that exact same look in the last year of his life, Vanessa felt something cold settle low in her stomach. "Where did you actually go?" she asked, closing her laptop now, giving him her full attention for the first time since he'd walked in. "Nowhere important," Daniel said, and went upstairs without another word. Vanessa sat alone in the study for a long moment after he left, staring at the closed door. Then she picked up her phone and typed a single message to a number saved only under the initials R.G. The private investigator she had quietly retained 6 years earlier, the same year she'd first read Richard Cross's ledgers, to make absolutely certain that whatever ghosts existed in this family's past stayed exactly where she'd buried them. "Something happened tonight," she typed. "Find out what." She hit send before she even let herself consider that the answer might be something she couldn't control. Vanessa had built her entire life on the principle that vulnerability was a door left open for other people to walk through uninvited, and she had spent years making certain no such door existed anywhere near her. She had watched her own mother lose everything twice. Once in a divorce that stripped away the family's remaining dignity along with its remaining money, and once again a decade later, when a business partner she'd trusted too easily walked away with the last of it, leaving Vanessa's mother to spend her final years in a modest apartment she never stopped apologizing for. Vanessa had promised herself, somewhere around 14 years old, standing in that apartment's small kitchen, listening to her mother cry quietly behind a closed door, that she would never again let her security depend on anyone else's honesty. Marrying Daniel had never been purely mercenary, whatever cold calculations she made afterward. She had been genuinely drawn to him in the beginning. His quiet decency, the way he tipped generously without announcing it, the way he remembered the names of employees 3 tiers below him in the company. But even in those early months, some watchful part of her had never fully switched off, cataloging every asset, every legal structure, every possible vulnerability in the life she was building, the way a soldier scans a room for exits before ever sitting down to eat. She thought, staring at her phone after sending the message to her investigator, about the year she'd spent visiting Richard Cross in hospice, holding his hand while machines beeped steadily beside his bed, listening to a dying man's fragmented, guilt-soaked confessions about a woman named Ruth. She had told herself at the time that she was simply being a good daughter-in-law, present in a way Daniel, busy, grieving in his own distant fashion, unable to sit still in hospital rooms, hadn't managed to be. She hadn't fully admitted, even to herself, that she was also listening for information, cataloging, preparing. She was good at not fully admitting things to herself. It was in some ways the only skill that had ever kept her safe. Now, 9 years into a marriage built on a foundation she had quietly reinforced with a dying man's secrets, she felt that old, watchful alertness rising in her chest again, sharper than it had been in years, and she understood, with the clarity of someone who has spent a lifetime reading rooms for danger, that whatever Daniel had found tonight, it was the first real threat to the life she'd built that she hadn't seen coming in advance. She didn't sleep. She sat in the dark study long after Daniel's footsteps had gone quiet upstairs, turning the problem over, the way she turned over every problem, not with panic, but with the cold, methodical patience of a woman who had learned, a long time ago, that patience was the only weapon poor girls were ever handed for free. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat in his home office until 3 a.m., with the lights off, a single desk lamp illuminating a photograph he hadn't looked at in 15 years. A photograph he'd pulled from a locked drawer the moment he got home, hands shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to work the small key. The photograph showed his father, younger, standing in front of the very first Crosswell warehouse, arm around a woman with dark hair and a guarded smile, a woman whose face Daniel had seen only in fragments of memory from childhood, a woman who used to visit the house sometimes when he was very small, who always brought him hard candy from a tin in her coat pocket, who disappeared from his life so completely and so suddenly that by the time he was 7, he'd assumed he had imagined her. His father had called her Ruthie in the photograph's inscription, written in fading pen on the back, R and me, the year everything started. She'll never let me forget it. Daniel had asked his father about her exactly once, when he was 22, freshly graduated, and starting to learn the company's real financial history. His father's face had changed in a way Daniel had never forgotten, the only time in his life he'd seen Richard Cross look afraid. "She's gone, Daniel," his father had said. "She left. Business partnerships end, that's all you need to know." Cow. Daniel hadn't pushed. He regretted that now, sitting in the dark 15 years later, staring at a coin he could still picture perfectly in a stranger's coin purse. The next morning, he made a decision that surprised even him. He asked Priya, his assistant, to quietly pull the original 1998 partnership documentation from the company's archived legal storage. Not through the general counsel's office, not through any official channel that would leave a footprint anyone else could trace. Just him, and a storage facility 30 miles outside the city that Crosswell had used for decades to house records nobody had opened in years. "Everything okay, Mr. Cross?" Priya asked, watching him more carefully than usual. "I found something," Daniel said. "I don't know what it means yet." He didn't tell her about the woman at the grocery store. He didn't tell Vanessa either, though he noticed, with a small, uncomfortable jolt, that Vanessa had started asking him pointed questions at breakfast that morning, where he'd been the previous evening, whether the audit issue with the board was resolved, whether he'd been under unusual stress lately. Questions that sounded caring on the surface and felt, underneath, like probing. He told himself he was being paranoid. 9 years of marriage did that sometimes. Made you read suspicion into ordinary concern. He pushed the thought away and focused on the one lead he had. A stranger in a grocery store, a coin that shouldn't exist, and a woman his father had erased so thoroughly that Daniel had once genuinely believed he'd invented her. Finding Maria wasn't difficult, not for a man with Daniel's resources, though he hesitated for 2 full days before doing it. He told himself it was because he respected her privacy. The truth, which he admitted to himself only much later, was that some part of him already suspected that once he found her, there would be no going back to not knowing. He had pulled the store's security footage under the vague explanation of reviewing a customer service incident, then had a junior analyst, someone who had no idea what they were actually looking for, run a basic facial match against public records. Within a day and a half he had a name, Maria Alvarez, an address in a modest apartment complex 14 minutes from the store. 2 children enrolled at a public elementary school 3 blocks from that address. He stared at the file for a long time. He did not go himself. Instead, he called a woman he'd worked with twice before on delicate, quiet matters for the company. A former social worker named Grace Okafor, sharp, discreet, someone who had once helped Crosswell smooth over a labor dispute, without a single reporter catching wind of it. He asked her to visit Maria under the pretense of a community outreach survey, something connected loosely, but not officially, to the Whitmore Cross Foundation's public programs. He specifically instructed her not to mention his name. "What am I actually looking for, Daniel?" Grace asked over the phone, her voice sharp with the particular skepticism of someone who had done enough favors for powerful men to know when they weren't telling her everything. "I need to know if she has any old coins," Daniel said carefully. "Small, dull silver, irregular edges. I need to know how many, and I need you to look, carefully, without alarming her, at any numbers stamped on the underside." There was a long pause on the line. "Daniel?" Grace said slowly. "What did you find?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "That's the problem." He hung up before she could ask anything else, and sat with the weight of what he'd just done. Sending someone into a stranger's home under false pretenses to examine an object that might be nothing more than a poor woman's family heirloom, might be exactly nothing, might turn his entire understanding of his father's company into a lie built on a woman's disappearance that Daniel was only now, for the first time in his adult life, allowing himself to actually question. 2 floors up, in a room she thought was soundproof enough, Vanessa was on the phone as well. A different call, a different purpose. Her voice dropped to the low, careful register she used only when she was protecting something. "He's been distracted for 2 days," she said. "Distant, asking odd questions at breakfast. I need to know exactly where he goes and who he talks to. Discreetly, he can't know you're watching him." She listened for a moment, then added, in a tone that would have frightened Daniel had he heard it, a tone with no warmth left in it at all. "And find out who that woman is, the one from the grocery store 2 nights ago. I want a name by tomorrow." The investigator, a former financial crimes detective named Reyes Garner, who had worked with Vanessa on 3 previous sensitive matters over the years, none of which either of them had ever discussed with anyone else, texted back within the hour. "On it. Should have something concrete in 24 to 48. Vanessa set the phone down and sat for a long moment in the dark study, listening to the old house settle around her, thinking about the particular texture of fear that came from watching a carefully built life develop its first visible crack. She had felt this exact sensation only once before, 6 years earlier, the week after Richard Cross's funeral, when she'd realized, sitting alone in her car outside the funeral home, still in her black dress, that the only person who fully understood the secret she now carried was gone, and that whatever protection his silence had once offered her had died along with him. She had spent the 6 years since building her own protections instead of relying on his. The foundation, the board seat. The careful, patient accumulation of goodwill and public reputation that made her nearly untouchable in the social circles that mattered. She had told herself, more than once, that she'd done enough, that the past was buried deep enough now that nothing short of an excavation crew could unearth it. She hadn't accounted for a coin catching the light in a grocery store, held by a woman who had no idea what she was carrying. Vanessa allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of fear. That was the rule she'd set for herself years earlier, in the aftermath of her mother's second financial collapse. 10 minutes to feel whatever needed feeling, and then the feeling had to convert into a plan, or it wasn't allowed to exist at all. She sat with the 10 minutes, let her hands shake once, quietly, in the dark where no one could see them. And then she stood up, straightened her blouse, and went to bed beside a husband she had once loved and now, for the first time in 9 years, genuinely feared. Grace Okafor arrived at Maria's apartment on a Thursday afternoon, clipboard in hand, wearing the kind of soft, approachable cardigan that made people trust her instantly. She introduced herself as a caseworker doing a brief community well-being survey, part of a foundation initiative supporting single mothers in the area. Maria let her in more out of politeness than trust. She had learned over the years to be wary of people who showed up with clipboards and kind smiles, because kindness with paperwork attached usually came with strings she couldn't afford to owe. But Sophia and Mateo were doing homework at the kitchen table, and Grace's questions started ordinary enough. About the children's school, about Maria's work schedule, about whether she had access to affordable health care. Then, carefully, gently, Grace asked about family heirlooms. Sometimes, she said, our foundation helps families get formal appraisals on inherited items, in case there's ever a need for emergency funds. Do you have anything like that? Jewelry, old currency, anything passed down? Maria's whole body went still. Why are you asking that? She said. It's just part of the standard survey, Grace said, keeping her voice light, though something in Maria's sudden tension made her own pulse quicken. Totally optional. Some families have things they don't even realize could help them. Maria looked at her for a long moment, weighing something. Then, almost against her own better judgment, because some tired, worn-down part of her was still, after everything, hopeful that maybe this time a knock on the door meant help instead of harm. She said quietly, I have some old coins. From my foster mother. I don't know what they're worth. I've never had them looked at. Would you mind if I just glanced at them? No obligation. I won't take them anywhere. Maria hesitated. Ruth's warning echoed in her mind, the way it always did whenever this exact temptation arose. Never show them to anyone with money. But Grace didn't look like she had money. She looked like a tired caseworker in a cardigan, doing an unglamorous job for an underfunded charity. Maria retrieved the tin box from her closet. Grace counted 12 identical coins, laid them gently on the kitchen table, turned each one over with careful fingers, and found, on the underside of every single one, a tiny stamped number, 01 through 12. So small she needed to angle it toward the window light, to read clearly. She photographed each coin discreetly with her phone, angled to avoid catching Maria's face or anything identifying in the background. Then thanked Maria for her time and left within 20 minutes, promising a follow-up call about the survey results that she and Maria both silently understood would probably never come. That night, Grace sent Daniel the photographs with a single message, 12 coins, all numbered 1 through 12. She has no idea what they are. Daniel stared at his phone for nearly a full minute without moving. Only 12 coins had ever been minted. A private numbered token system his father had commissioned decades ago, back when Crosswell Logistics was still a private partnership between two people, before it became the sprawling public company Daniel now ran. Daniel had heard about the tokens only once, from the old family lawyer, Harold Weiss, at his father's funeral, half drunk and looser-lipped than Daniel had ever seen him. Your father always said, if all 12 tokens ever came back together, the whole company changes hands. Good thing they're gone. Good thing that woman's gone. At the time, Daniel had assumed it was funeral talk, The kind of strange, half-true stories that surface when grief loosens people's tongues. He hadn't thought about it again in years. Now he understood. The tokens weren't decorative. They weren't sentimental. They were physical proof of an ownership stake. A stake his father had always claimed no longer existed because the woman who held it had vanished before she could ever claim it. 12 tokens, all numbered, all accounted for, in the coin purse of a poor single mother who had no idea what she was holding. Daniel sat with that knowledge for a long time before he did the one thing he had been avoiding since the moment he saw that coin catch the light in a grocery store 2 nights earlier. He picked up his phone, found Maria's address in the file Priya had pulled, and typed out a message to Grace. Set up a meeting. Just me and her. I'll go myself this time. 2 floors above him, unseen and unheard, Vanessa's investigator had already sent his own report. A name, an address, a photograph of Maria Alvarez taken from a distance outside her apartment complex, and a single unsettling line at the bottom that Vanessa read 3 times before setting her phone face down on the nightstand. Subject visited twice this week by a woman connected to a caseworker previously used by Crosswell Logistics for sensitive matters. Recommend deeper background check. Vanessa didn't sleep much that night either. But where Daniel's sleeplessness came from confusion and grief he didn't yet understand, Vanessa's came from something colder and far more practiced, the particular, focused alertness of a woman who has spent 6 years quietly guarding a secret, and has just realized, for the first time, that the secret might be closer to escaping than she ever allowed herself to imagine. She didn't think, not yet, about an affair. She thought about ledgers, she thought about a will. She thought about a clause she had convinced a dying man to sign years before Daniel ever proposed to her. And she thought, with a cold clarity that frightened even her, that whatever Daniel had found, she would need to control it, completely, and soon, before it controlled her. Priya noticed the change in Daniel before anyone else at Crosswell did. She had worked as his assistant for 6 years, long enough to recognize every register of his moods, the tight-jawed focus of a difficult negotiation, the loose, easy humor of a good quarter, the particular quiet he fell into on the anniversary of his father's death each year, a quiet that made the whole office move a little more carefully around him without anyone ever saying why. This was different. This was a man who kept starting sentences and not finishing them, who asked her twice in one afternoon whether she'd pulled the archived legal documents yet, who stared at his phone for long stretches without appearing to actually read anything on the screen. You can tell me, you know, Priya said carefully, setting a coffee on his desk that he wouldn't touch for 2 hours. Whatever it is, I've kept plenty of your secrets before. This one's not really mine to keep or share, Daniel said, which told Priya almost nothing and everything at once. She'd learned, over the years, to recognize the shape of a man protecting someone else, and she filed the observation away without pushing further, the way a good assistant learns to hold questions until their employer is ready to answer them on his own terms. She did, however, notice something else that afternoon. A call that came through the front office. From a woman identifying herself only as calling on behalf of Mrs. Cross, requesting Daniel's full meeting calendar for the past 2 weeks, a request Priya found unusual enough that she mentioned it to Daniel almost as an afterthought before he left for the day. Mrs. Cross's office called, she said. Wanted your calendar. I told them I'd need your approval first, since it wasn't going through the normal channels. Daniel paused at the door, something unreadable crossing his face. Good, he said. Don't send it. Not yet. Priya nodded slowly, filing this away too, and watched her boss walk out of the office that evening, looking, for the first time in the 6 years she'd known him, genuinely uncertain of what waited for him at home. Daniel came to Maria's apartment on a Saturday morning, alone, dressed plainly again, introducing himself only by his first name. Daniel, he said, when she opened the door with Sophia peeking curiously from behind her leg. I think you dropped something at the grocery store the other night. I wanted to make sure you got it back. It was a small, awkward lie. He was holding nothing, and they both seemed to understand it wasn't really about anything she'd dropped. But it gave them both permission to have a conversation neither fully understood the stakes of yet. Maria let him in, more out of curiosity than trust this time. She recognized him now, of course. The man from the store, the one who'd paid and vanished before she could thank him. She'd wondered about him more than she wanted to admit over the past several days. They sat at her small kitchen table while the twins watched cartoons in the next room. Daniel asked careful, seemingly casual questions about her family, about how long she'd lived in the city, about whether she had any relatives nearby. Maria, guarded but not unkind, answered honestly, until he asked, almost too gently, "Do you know much about your foster mother, before she took you in, I mean? Where she came from?" Something in Maria's chest tightened at the question, the same tightness she'd felt when Grace asked about the coins. "Not really," she said slowly. "She never talked about her life before me. I used to ask. She'd just say the past doesn't feed anybody, and change the subject." "What was she like?" Daniel asked, and this time, he couldn't quite keep his voice steady. Maria studied him for a moment before answering, some instinct telling her this question mattered more to him than he was letting on. "Quiet. Strict but fair. She had a slight accent I could never place, maybe Eastern European, maybe something else she never said. She ran a tailoring shop, and she had this scar." Maria touched her own left palm, tracing a line across it. "Right here. She said it was from a factory accident, a machine that didn't like her. She never told me more than that." Daniel's face went white. He remembered that scar. He remembered it from childhood, from a woman who used to bring him hard candy, who used to laugh at something his father said, and then go quiet in a way that even as a small child he'd sensed was more complicated than it looked. "Her name," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Was it Ruth?" Maria's breath caught. "How do you know that?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He sat there, staring at the table, at his own hands, at 26 years of his father's careful silence collapsing all at once in a small kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and cheap coffee. "I think," he said finally, choosing each word like it might shatter something if he got it wrong. "I think I knew her too. A long time ago." Maria's eyes filled with 100 questions at once. Questions she didn't yet have the language to ask, because she didn't yet understand what she was even asking about. "How? Who are you? Why did you really come here?" Daniel stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. He looked for a moment, like a man who had walked into a room expecting one truth and found an entirely different, far more dangerous one waiting for him instead. "I need to check something first," he said. "I promise I'll come back and explain everything, I need to be sure." He left before Maria could stop him, the same way he'd left the grocery store days earlier. Without warning, without closure, leaving behind more questions than answers. Maria stood in her kitchen for a long time after the door closed, one hand still pressed against her own scar-free palm, thinking about a woman she'd loved and never fully known. A woman who had spent 8 years raising her, and had never once explained why a coin box needed a promise sealed in fear. Across the city, Daniel drove straight to the storage facility where Crosswell's oldest records were kept, the ones Priya had pulled for him 2 days earlier. He spread the documents across a folding table in a cold, fluorescent-lit room, and found in a folder marked, simply 1998. Founding Partnership, a signed contract between his father, Richard Cross, and a woman named, not Ruth, not the simple name he'd known her by as a child, but Ruth Alvarez Whitmore, granting her a 30% ownership stake in the company that would become Crosswell Logistics. He read the surname twice before it landed fully. Alvarez. The same surname Maria carried. Not a coincidence, not distant. A direct thread, 26 years old, connecting a poor single mother in a rundown apartment to a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A fortune Daniel had spent his entire adult life believing was simply, uncomplicatedly, his family's own. At the bottom of the contract, in dense legal language he had to read 3 times to fully understand, was a clause he hadn't expected at all. In the event of the undersigned's death or permanent incapacitation, her ownership interest shall transfer in full to any living direct descendant, biological or legally recognized, without further condition. Daniel sat back in the cold storage room, the fluorescent light humming overhead, and understood, with a dread that settled into his bones like ice water, that the question was no longer whether Maria was connected to his father's missing partner. The question now was whether the law considered her a descendant at all, and buried somewhere in these boxes, he suspected, was an answer that would either save Maria's entire future or take away the only inheritance she never even knew she had a right to hope for. Daniel spent the next 3 days buried in storage boxes, canceling every meeting on his calendar, telling Priya only that he was dealing with a personal matter, and that she should route everything else to his deputy CFO. He found the adoption filing on the 3rd day, tucked inside a folder that had nothing to do with the company at all. A personal file his father had apparently kept separate, hidden among old tax documents in a box marked, almost carelessly, Miss Ski, 1999. It was an adoption petition, filed 26 years ago in family court, listing Ruth Alvarez Whitmore as the petitioner and a 9-year-old foster child as the subject. A child listed under the birth name Maria Alvarez Whitmore. The petition was never finalized. A stamp across the front page read simply, "Withdrawn, petitioner unresponsive." Daniel stared at that stamp for a long time. Ruth hadn't just fostered Maria. She had been in the process of legally adopting her, off the books, quietly. The same year, Daniel now realized with mounting horror that the last documented correspondence between Ruth and his father's company appeared in the archive. The same year, Ruth disappeared entirely from Daniel's childhood memories, from his father's business records, from every trace of a life that should have left far more evidence than this. He dug further, deeper into boxes he suspected his father had never expected anyone to open again, and found what he'd been dreading without fully admitting he was dreading it. Internal shipment logs from that same year, cross-referenced against tax filings, showing a pattern so consistent it couldn't be accidental. Shipment values systematically underreported, profits skimmed and redirected into accounts that predated the company's public formation, accounts Richard Cross had controlled entirely on his own. Ruth had found it. Daniel didn't have direct proof of that yet, not in black and white. But the timeline told its own story clearly enough. The fraud, the sudden disappearance of a 30% partner, the adoption petition abandoned mid-process, all clustered in the same 8-week window 26 years ago. Daniel sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit, surrounded by boxes, and let a truth settle over him that he could no longer talk himself out of. His father hadn't lost a business partner to some vague, unfortunate parting of ways. His father had pushed her out, threatened her most likely, though Daniel had no proof of that yet either. Erased her from the company's history so thoroughly that even his own son had spent 15 years believing she was a childhood invention, a half-remembered ghost with hard candy in her coat pocket. And Ruth, brilliant, careful, terrified Ruth, had done the only thing she could think to do with what little power she had left. She had run, taking a 9-year-old girl she loved enough to try adopting in secret, and she had hidden 12 tokens of proof in a tin box, and she had spent the rest of her life running a small tailoring shop under a name that wasn't quite hers, warning the daughter she never got to legally claim. Never sell these, never show them to anyone with money. Because she knew. She had always known that if those tokens ever surfaced, if anyone with the resources to understand their meaning ever saw them, it would put a target on the only family she had left. Daniel had unknowingly become exactly the kind of person she'd warned Maria about. He sat with that for a long, silent moment in the cold storage unit, the weight of his own family's history pressing down on him with a force he hadn't braced for. He wasn't the hero of this story. He understood that now, with a clarity that made his stomach turn. He was, at best, the reluctant inheritor of a theft. At worst, he was simply the next generation of the same family that had destroyed Ruth's life. A man who had shown up at a grocery store, recognized stolen proof in a stranger's coin purse, and quietly investigated her instead of simply telling her the truth. He thought about Maria's face when she'd asked him, "Who are you? Why did you really come here?" And he understood, with something close to shame that he still hadn't given her an honest answer. He picked up his phone to call Grace, to arrange a real conversation with Maria, one where he told her everything he now knew. Before he could dial, the phone rang first. Priya's name on the screen, her voice tight and urgent the moment he answered. "Mr. Cross, I think you need to come back to the office. Mrs. Cross is meeting with the general counsel right now. She's asking for your full calendar from the last 2 weeks, and she's asked legal to prepare something about a fitness review for the board." Daniel felt the floor of his understanding shift a second time in the same afternoon. "A fitness review for who?" he asked, though some cold sinking part of him already suspected the answer. Priya's voice dropped lower. "For you, sir." Vanessa moved fast, faster than Daniel expected, faster than even she had planned to just 3 days earlier. She had spent 6 years building walls around the truth she'd inherited from a dying old man's confession, and now that Daniel was closing in on it from the inside, she did what she had always done best. She found the angle that protected her position first, and worried about everything else afterward. She met privately with Harold Weiss's successor at the firm, a sharp young general counsel named Marcus Feld, who owed his position largely to Vanessa's quiet advocacy 2 years earlier, and framed her concern carefully. Daniel had been erratic, distracted, missing meetings, authorizing unexplained payments to a caseworker with no documented connection to any active foundation program, making unscheduled visits to a woman in a low-income housing complex, alone, without any staff or security present. Wasn't this exactly the kind of pattern the board's governance committee should be made aware of, purely as a precaution, purely to protect the company and, of course, to protect Daniel himself? Marcus, cautious but not immune to Vanessa's careful framing, agreed to begin drafting preliminary documentation. Nothing filed yet, nothing official, just groundwork, in case it becomes necessary. It wasn't about the marriage anymore, if it ever had been. Vanessa had briefly entertained, in her coldest private moments, the possibility of an affair, had even, for one night, allowed herself the almost human relief of imagining a mundane betrayal, something ordinary and survivable, instead of the alternative she feared far more. But her investigators' reports made clear this wasn't romantic. This was worse. Daniel was pulling old partnership records. He'd spent 3 days locked in a storage facility. He'd met twice with a poor woman whose surname, when Vanessa finally saw it in a report, made her blood run cold in a way no suspected affair ever could. Alvarez. Vanessa had read that surname once before, 6 years ago, in the margin of an old, hand-annotated ledger Richard Cross had shown her during one of his final, medicated confessions. A name he'd murmured with something between guilt and fear, a name she had filed away and never expected to hear again outside that dim hospice room. If Daniel found the connection Vanessa suspected he was finding, everything she had spent 6 years quietly protecting, her board seat, her wealth, the foundation that had built her public identity, the entire architecture of the life she'd constructed around a marriage she had never fully loved but had absolutely meticulously secured, all of it stood to collapse. She needed leverage, real leverage, not just legal groundwork that might take months to matter. That was when her investigators' report surfaced something else entirely. Maria Alvarez had an unresolved custody arrangement with the biological father of her twins, a man named Tomas Reyes who had abandoned the family 3 years earlier and had never formally relinquished parental rights, meaning he could, technically, still file for custody at any time, with almost no legal obstacle standing in his way beyond his own absence and disinterest. Vanessa read that detail twice, and felt something in her chest go very still and very calculating. She didn't want the children. She felt, if she allowed herself to feel anything about it at all, a distant, clinical discomfort at what she was about to do. The closest thing to conscience Vanessa still had access to after years of practiced self-protection. But she understood, with the precision of a woman who had spent her adult life reading leverage the way other people read weather, that a mother facing the sudden threat of losing her children would settle almost any dispute quickly, quietly, and cheaply, just to make the threat disappear. She had her investigator locate Tomas Reyes within 2 days. He was living 3 states away, working intermittently, drinking more than he should, The kind of man who had spent 3 years telling himself his children were better off without him, and had almost believed it. Vanessa didn't contact him directly, she was too careful for that. She had an intermediary. A small, discreet legal services firm she'd used before for matters requiring distance. Reach out under the framing of family reunification support services, offering to cover all legal costs if Tomas wished to pursue his parental rights. No explanation given for why. No connection to Crosswell or the Cross family name anywhere in the paperwork. Tomas, 3 states away, staring at an offer that required nothing from him but a signature, and the vague, self-flattering idea that maybe he could still be a father after all. Signed it within a week. Neither Maria nor Daniel knew yet what had just been set in motion. Maria received a legal notice 4 days later, a formal filing for an emergency custody hearing, citing abandonment risk and insufficient stable income as grounds for review. Her twins' father listed as petitioner, a court date set for less than 3 weeks out. She read the letter standing in her kitchen, Sophia and Mateo doing homework at the table exactly where Daniel had sat days earlier, and felt the floor of her entire world tilt sideways. She had survived poverty. She had survived Tomas leaving without warning. She had survived 8 years of guarding a secret she didn't understand, protecting a promise made to a dying woman she'd loved more than anyone. She had never, not once, considered that someone might come for her children. She didn't yet know who was really behind it. She only knew, staring at a stranger's legal signature at the bottom of a court filing, that the fear Ruth had tried to warn her about all those years ago had finally, unmistakably, arrived at her door. Grace Okafor had never planned on getting this involved. 2 days after Vanessa's investigator identified her as the go-between connecting Daniel to Maria, Grace received a call from a woman who introduced herself only as someone representing Mrs. Cross's interests, offering a payment, a substantial one, more than Grace typically earned in 6 months of freelance casework, in exchange for detailed reports on everything Daniel was doing, everyone he was meeting, everything he'd found. Grace didn't answer right away. She sat with the offer for a full day, turning it over, thinking about rent, thinking about the ethics she'd built her entire career on, thinking about the strange growing unease she'd felt ever since photographing 12 numbered coins on a poor woman's kitchen table. She declined the payment. But she didn't call Daniel either, not immediately. Something about the whole arrangement had started to feel wrong in a way that went beyond simple client confidentiality. The secrecy, the urgency, the way Daniel had asked her not to explain anything to Maria, the way a stranger's money had suddenly appeared offering her double for information about the same situation. Grace had spent years learning to recognize when powerful people were maneuvering around a vulnerable person, instead of actually helping them, and this had started to smell exactly like that, regardless of which side was paying her. So instead, she did something neither Daniel nor Vanessa expected. She went back to Maria directly. She sat at the same kitchen table where she'd first examined the coins, and this time she told Maria everything she knew: the numbered tokens, the partnership contract, Daniel's family connection to a company called Crosswell Logistics, the fact that someone else, someone connected to Daniel's wife, had just tried to pay Grace to spy on the situation from the other side. Maria listened in near silence, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of cooling coffee, the custody notice still sitting unopened on the counter behind her, because she hadn't been able to bring herself to read it a second time since the day it arrived. "Why are you telling me this?" Maria finally asked. "You work for him." "I worked for a fee," Grace said carefully. "That's different from loyalty. And whatever's happening here is bigger than a job anymore. You deserve to know what people are doing around you, even if they think they're protecting you by keeping you in the dark." Maria showed her the custody notice. Grace read it twice, her expression shifting from concern to something sharper, more focused. "This is fast," she said. "Emergency hearings for an absent parent who's shown zero interest in 3 years don't usually move this quickly unless someone's funding the legal push. Someone with real money and a real reason to want this resolved fast." The two women sat with that realization together, and slowly, carefully, began pulling at threads Daniel himself hadn't yet had time to connect. The timing of the filing, so precisely aligned with Daniel's visits to Maria's apartment. The unusually well-funded legal team suddenly representing a man who'd previously shown no financial capacity to pursue any legal action at all. The strange, unsettling coincidence that this had all begun less than a week after a woman connected to Daniel's wife had approached Grace with an offer for information. "I think," Grace said slowly, thinking out loud, "someone doesn't want this custody hearing to be about your children at all. I think it's about making you desperate enough to give something else up quietly, before it ever becomes public." Maria's stomach turned. "The coins," she whispered. "Maybe," Grace said. "Or whatever the coins represent. I don't fully understand the legal side yet, but I know pressure campaigns when I see one, and this has the shape of one." Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel had begun his own quiet investigation into the sudden fitness review Vanessa had initiated against him, pulling his own financial records to preempt whatever narrative was being built, and in doing so, stumbled onto something he hadn't been looking for at all: a pattern of transfers from Vanessa's personal accounts to an intermediary legal services firm, dated exactly 1 week before Maria's custody notice arrived. He cross-referenced the firm's name against public court filings, and found, buried in a footnote of the emergency custody petition, the same firm listed as covering all associated legal costs on behalf of the petitioner. Daniel sat back in his chair, the pieces of 2 separate investigations, his own into his father's past, and this new, unwelcome discovery into his wife's present, beginning, horribly, to overlap. He picked up his phone and called Grace. "I need to see Maria," he said, before Grace could even say hello. "Tonight. I think I know who's behind the custody filing, and I don't think it has anything to do with her ex-husband at all." Daniel arrived that night with a folder under his arm, thicker than the one he'd brought the first time, and this time he didn't hesitate at the door. "I need to tell you everything," he said, before Maria had even fully opened it. "All of it. No more careful questions. You deserve the whole truth right now." Grace was already there, sitting at the kitchen table, and the 3 of them spent the next hour laying out a story that had taken 26 years to fully surface. Daniel told Maria about the photograph of his father and a woman named Ruthie, about the coin he'd recognized in her purse from across a grocery store line, a recognition that had frozen his blood because it meant a secret he'd been told was buried forever, was standing 3 feet in front of him, held by a stranger who had no idea what she was carrying. He told her about the 1998 partnership contract, about Ruth Alvarez Whitmore's 30% ownership stake, about the clause guaranteeing that stake would transfer to any living descendant upon her death. He told her about the abandoned adoption filing, the one listing Maria's own name, Maria Alvarez Whitmore, a filing Ruth had started and never finished, not because she changed her mind, but because she disappeared before she could complete it. "She wasn't just your foster mother," Daniel said quietly. "She was trying to adopt you, legally, for real. She was in the process of making you hers, permanently, right before she vanished." Maria's hands had gone still on the table, her coffee long forgotten, tears. She hadn't given herself permission to shed yet building behind her eyes. Daniel told her the hardest part last, that Ruth hadn't simply left the company, hadn't simply chosen to walk away from a business partnership, the way his father had always claimed. Ruth had discovered that Richard Cross was defrauding their partnership, skimming and underreporting profits for years, and when she confronted him or threatened to expose it, Daniel didn't yet know which, the records didn't say, his father had found a way to make her disappear from the company's history entirely, threatened or coerced, or simply frightened into vanishing, taking with her only a 9-year-old girl she loved, and 12 small coins that proved the truth she could never safely speak aloud. "Your mother," Daniel said, correcting himself immediately, gently. "Your Ruth. She didn't run because she stopped caring about you. She ran because my father made it too dangerous for her to stay, and she spent the rest of her life protecting you from a family that had already hurt her once, and might hurt you too, if they ever found out you existed." Maria sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing 26 years of buried history all at once. Then her expression hardened into something Daniel hadn't expected. "You knew all of this," she said slowly, "and you still sent someone to my house under a lie. You still watched me, investigated me. Had my face run through some kind of database before you ever told me the truth." "Yes," Daniel admitted, because there was no honest way around it. "I did." "Why?" Maria's voice cracked, anger and hurt tangled together. "Did you help me because you actually cared what happened to a stranger and her kids? Or because you needed to know what I was sitting on before you decided whether I mattered?" Daniel didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched long enough that Grace shifted uncomfortably in her seat, watching a man who clearly hadn't expected to be asked the one question he hadn't fully answered for himself yet either. "I don't know," he finally said, quiet and unguarded in a way Maria hadn't heard from him before. "I told myself it was both. I told myself I was being careful, responsible, that I needed to understand before I disrupted your life with something this enormous. But if I'm honest with you right now, standing in your kitchen, I didn't know which reason was really driving me until this exact moment, and the first think that's a terrible thing to admit. But it's the truth, and you deserve the truth more than you deserve my comfort." Maria was quiet for a long moment, turning his answer over the way she turned over the coins in the tin box on the hardest nights, looking for the seam, the place where honesty ended and performance began. She had spent enough of her life being managed by people who thought they knew what was best for her to recognize the particular exhaustion of being handled with care instead of respected with truth. Tomas had done it, in his own way, in the final months before he left. A slow accumulation of small omissions dressed up as protection, right up until the omissions became a note on the kitchen counter and an empty side of the bed. "I need you to understand something," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have spent my whole life being the person things happen to. Foster homes I didn't choose, a husband who decided, without asking me, that I could handle raising 2 children alone because apparently I looked strong enough to survive it. A dead woman's secret I've carried for 8 years without ever being told what I was protecting or why. I am so tired, Daniel, of finding out after the fact that decisions were being made about my life by people who thought they knew better than I did." "You're right," Daniel said, and he didn't try to soften it, which she noticed, and which mattered more to her than any apology would have. "I should have come to you the first day. I told myself I needed to be sure before I disrupted your life. But if I'm being honest, some part of me was also protecting myself. Protecting my own comfort, giving myself time to prepare for whatever this turned out to mean, before I had to face you with it. That wasn't fair to you. I see that now." Grace, who had been quietly watching the exchange from across the table, finally spoke. "For what it's worth," she said to Maria, "I don't think either of you fully understands yet what any of this means. Not the legal weight of it, not what it's going to require of you. I think the most useful thing either of you can do right now is stop trying to protect each other from information and start being honest about what you don't know." Maria let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, something in her shoulders loosening slightly for the first time since Grace had first knocked on her door with a clipboard and a lie about a community survey. "Okay," she said, "then tell me everything you don't know yet either. Because I think I'd rather sit in uncertainty with people who are honest about it than sit in false comfort with people who aren't." Maria studied him for a long moment, some of the anger in her expression softening into something more exhausted than forgiving. "And the custody filing," she said, "is that connected to this too?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I believe so. I found transfers from my wife's personal accounts to the exact legal firm now funding your ex-husband's custody claim. I think she's trying to pressure you into settling any claim on Ruth's estate quietly, before it ever becomes public, using your children as leverage to make you desperate enough to give up something you don't even fully understand you have a right to yet." Maria felt the room tilt again, a different kind of horror settling over the first. "She's using my kids," Maria whispered, "to protect a secret that isn't even mine. That was never mine. I just happened to be the girl a dying woman loved enough to hide it with." "Yes," Daniel said, "and I intend to stop her, whatever it costs me." He left Maria's apartment that night with a promise to return within days, but not before Maria stopped him at the door, her hand resting briefly against the frame, blocking his exit just long enough to ask one more question. "Did you love her?" Maria asked. "Ruth, when you were a child? Or is this just about a company you're afraid of losing?" Daniel considered the question longer than she expected. "I remember Hard Candy," he said finally. "I remember she used to hum while she talked to my father, this specific tune I can't place anymore. And I remember feeling, even as a very small child, like she saw me in a way most adults didn't bother to. I didn't understand any of that as love at the time. I was 5, maybe 6. But I've thought about her more in the last week than I have in the last 30 years. And something about that feels like grief, even though I didn't know I had anything left to grieve." Maria nodded slowly, some of the hardness in her expression softening. Not into trust exactly, but into something adjacent to it. The recognition of a shared, complicated ache neither of them had expected to have in common. "She used to hum too," Maria said quietly, "while she sewed. I never knew the song either." Something passed between them in that small, unremarkable doorway. Not romance, not yet, nothing either of them would have named if pressed. But the first thin thread of a bond, built on something neither wealth nor poverty had ever given either of them. A shared orphaned memory of a woman who had loved carefully, quietly, and at enormous personal cost. Daniel left without saying anything else, and Maria stood in the doorway for a long time after his car pulled away, thinking about a tune she'd never been able to place, hummed by 2 different people in 2 different decades, connecting a life she'd always thought was entirely her own to a family she'd never known existed. Daniel went home that night and found Vanessa waiting for him in the study, the same room where this had all quietly begun days earlier, her laptop closed, her hands folded, her composure so perfectly intact that for a moment Daniel almost doubted everything he'd just learned. "We need to talk about the fitness review," she said, before he could speak first. "Marcus tells me you've been made aware. I want you to know it was precautionary, Daniel. I was worried about you." "Were you worried about me?" Daniel said, closing the door behind him with a quiet, deliberate click. "Or worried about what I'd find if I kept looking?" Something flickered across Vanessa's face. Not panic, not yet, but the first crack in a composure Daniel had rarely seen tested. "I don't know what you mean." "Ruth Alvarez Whitmore," Daniel said, watching her face carefully as he spoke the name aloud for the first time in his own home. 30% partner in my father's company. Forced out 26 years ago after she discovered he was defrauding the partnership. "You knew about her. You've known for years." Vanessa's silence lasted just long enough to answer the question before her words did. "Your father told me," she said finally, her voice flat now, stripped of the warmth she usually performed so effortlessly. "In his final months, he was scared and medicated and guilty, and he told me things he never told you, because you were his son and he couldn't bear for you to look at him the way he knew you'd look at him if you understood what he'd actually done." "And you used that," Daniel said. "You used his guilt. You secured yourself a board seat before we were even married. You had him write a clause into his will protecting you from any future claim on Ruth's estate. You've spent 6 years protecting a fraud my own father committed, and this week, when you realized I was getting close to the truth, you funded a stranger's custody claim against a mother of 2 just to scare her into silence." "I protected this family," Vanessa said, and for the first time her voice rose, sharp and defensive. "I protected everything you have, the company, the wealth, the life you've never once had to question because I made sure the truth stayed buried. You have no idea what I gave up to secure any of this, Daniel. You grew up with all of it handed to you. I built my position one careful move at a time, and I am not going to watch you burn it all down because you developed a conscience at 38 over a woman you met in a grocery store line a week and a half ago." "Her name is Maria," Daniel said quietly. "And she has 2 6-year-old children who are about to be pulled into a courtroom because you decided their fear was a useful tool." Vanessa's composure finally fully cracked. "I did what was necessary," she said, her voice low and hard now. "You'll lose everything trying to be good, Daniel. Do you understand that? Everything. The company, the board's confidence, your father's legacy, all of it. gone the moment this becomes public. I never wanted to be good. I wanted to survive, and I have survived. Every single day of a life that started with a lot less certainty than the one you were born into. Don't stand there and judge me for playing the only game either of us has ever really been given the rules to. Oh! Daniel looked at his wife. Really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years, and felt something settle in his chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief, but sat somewhere uneasily between the two. I'm going to the board, he said. I'm disclosing everything. My father's fraud, the original partnership contract, Ruth's disappearance, and your involvement in funding a custody claim to protect it. Before I go to any courtroom, I owe the people who trusted this company that much honesty, even if it costs me the company entirely. You'll destroy us, Vanessa said, and for one unguarded moment, something almost like fear broke through her voice. No, Daniel said, already turning toward the door. I think we destroyed ourselves a long time before I ever walked into that grocery store. I just finally noticed. He left her standing alone in the study, the same room she'd built 6 years of careful protection inside, and for the first time since she'd read Richard Cross's ledgers as a grieving future daughter-in-law, Vanessa Cross had absolutely no next move prepared. The shareholder meeting was scheduled for the following week, but Daniel didn't wait that long to act. Within 2 days, he had voluntarily briefed the board's independent audit committee, handed over every document from the storage facility, and requested that outside counsel, not Marcus Feld, whose loyalty Vanessa had quietly cultivated for years, review the full history of the 1998 partnership dispute. At the emergency shareholder session that followed, Daniel stood before the room and did something almost no one in that building had ever seen a Cross do. He told the truth about his own family, publicly, without softening it. He laid out the original partnership contract, the falsified shipment records, Ruth Alvarez Whitmore's 30% stake, and the descendant clause that had sat quietly in a 26-year-old contract, waiting. He named Maria Alvarez as Ruth's rightful heir under that clause, a clause, he pointed out with a bitter kind of irony, that his own father's lawyers had drafted, airtight enough that not even a cross-family attorney could argue around it now. Vanessa, seated near the front of the room in a composed navy suit, made one final attempt to control the narrative. She rose and addressed the board directly, her voice steady even as the room's attention turned toward her. She suggested, carefully, that Daniel's sudden fixation on this woman and her documents might not be about justice at all, that perhaps the board should consider whether Daniel's judgment had been compromised by a personal relationship with the claimant, whether these documents had even been properly verified, whether this entire disclosure was simply a cover for something far more ordinary and far less flattering to Daniel himself. It might have worked, had a board member in the back of the room, a quiet, elderly man named Elias Bram, who had sat on Crosswell's board for over 2 decades and rarely spoke at all, not raised his hand. I was the notary on that adoption filing, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence that followed, 26 years ago. I still have the witnessed original in my personal files. I remember the woman. I remember she was afraid, though I didn't understand why at the time. I believe everything Mr. Cross has presented here today is accurate, and I think this board has a legal and moral obligation to act on it immediately. The room turned to Vanessa. She had no answer prepared for a witness neither she nor Daniel had ever known existed. Within the month, Vanessa was removed from the board by unanimous vote. The company's legal team, now operating independently of her influence for the first time in years, cooperated with a civil investigation into the funding behind Maria's custody case, which was ultimately treated by family court as an act of financial coercion against a custodial parent, a finding that ended any possibility of the custody claim succeeding and opened Vanessa to separate legal exposure of her own. The Whitmore Cross Foundation, the charity Vanessa had built her public image around, was placed under independent leadership within weeks, its board quietly severing every remaining connection to her name. Tomas Reyes, confronted with the truth of what he had allowed himself to be used for, the reality that he'd nearly torn 2 children away from their mother, not out of any genuine desire to parent them, but because a stranger's money had made abandonment look, for one convenient moment, like redemption, withdrew his custody claim entirely within days of the story becoming public. He didn't reappear in the twins' lives afterward, but he didn't fight for them either. And for Maria, that quiet absence was, at last, its own small mercy. Vanessa's marriage to Daniel ended within the same month, quietly, without the public spectacle either of them might once have expected. There was no dramatic scene, no shouted accusations in front of cameras, just a signature, a division of assets already largely protected by the very prenuptial agreement Vanessa had once calculated so carefully, and a silence between two people who had built 9 years together on a foundation neither of them, in the end, had ever fully trusted. Justice, when it finally arrived, didn't feel like triumph to anyone involved. It felt like exhaustion and relief, and the strange, hollow quiet that follows the collapse of something that had once looked, from the outside, like an unshakable life. Maria was formally recognized as Ruth Alvarez Whitmore's legal heir 6 months later, after a quiet, careful court process that Daniel funded entirely on her behalf, insisting she never see a single invoice. When it came time to decide what to do with a settlement that could have changed her family's life in ways she'd never dared to imagine, private schools, a new home, a future with no more coin purse math at grocery store counters, Maria surprised everyone who thought they understood her, including herself. She didn't take a lump sum. She requested, instead, a structured settlement that would fund a scholarship and housing program for foster children, aging out of the system, with nowhere to go. No family to catch them, no tin box of secrets to protect them the way Ruth's had, however imperfectly, protected her. She named it simply, the Ruth Fund. She spent her whole life trying to build something safe for one child, Maria told Daniel, the day she signed the paperwork. I think it's time somebody finished what she started, for more than just me. Daniel stepped down as CEO of Crosswell Logistics 3 months after the shareholder meeting that had exposed his father's fraud, appointing a new leadership team he trusted to run the company with the transparency his father never had. He didn't disappear from the business world entirely. Instead, he took on a quieter role running the Ruth Fund alongside Maria, learning, slowly, and without much natural talent for it at first, how to build something instead of simply inheriting it. He and Maria did not fall into an easy cinematic romance, and the story resisted that convenient ending on purpose. Trust, once broken by investigation and hidden motives, doesn't rebuild itself in a single grand gesture. It rebuilds in small, unglamorous moments. A shared coffee after a long fund meeting, an honest apology Daniel offered more than once without being asked to, a friendship that grew carefully, at its own pace, rooted finally in honesty instead of secrecy. Sophia and Matteo, for their part, warmed to Daniel slowly, the way children do when they've learned caution the hard way. He didn't try to be their father. He showed up instead. For school recitals, for the awkward first months of a new house, for quiet Tuesday dinners that became, without anyone officially deciding it, a weekly tradition. He became something the twins hadn't quite had a word for before. Not a replacement for anyone, just a steady, trustworthy presence who kept his promises. At the opening of the Ruth Fund's first housing center for aging out foster youth, Maria stood before a small crowd. No press, no cameras, exactly the way she'd insisted it should be, and placed a single coin into a small glass display case near the entrance, just one. The other 11, she had decided months earlier, would never be sold, never be displayed, never be turned into anything other than what Ruth had always wanted them to be. Quietly retired, permanently out of circulation, kept safe the way Ruth herself had once been forced to disappear in order to survive. The single coin in the case, a small plaque read only, "For the woman who kept a secret to protect a promise." Maria stood in front of that case for a long moment after the small crowd had wandered off toward the refreshment table, Sophia's hand in one of hers, Matteo's in the other, thinking about a quiet woman with a scarred palm and an accent she never explained, who had loved a child enough to break the law trying to claim her, and loved her enough afterward to disappear rather than put her in danger. She thought about coins that had once meant fear, and now meant something entirely different. She thought, finally, that some inheritances aren't measured in money at all. That the truest thing Ruth had ever left her wasn't 12 pieces of stamped silver, but the simple, stubborn belief that even when the world gives you almost nothing, you protect the people you love with everything you have. And for the first time in 26 years, that belief no longer felt like a burden Maria carried alone. It felt, at last, like something she could finally set down and pass forward instead as a gift.
Moral of the story is that truth may be hidden for years, but it can never be buried forever. Fear, greed, and the desire to protect wealth or reputation can make people justify terrible decisions, but those decisions often create even greater pain for innocent people. Karen believed she was protecting her family and its future, yet her lies destroyed trust and deeply hurt people who had done nothing wrong. Adam learned that real strength does not come from money, power, or control. It comes from having the courage to face the truth, even when that truth exposes your own family. Megan's journey also shows that hardship does not define a person's worth. In the end, honesty, compassion, accountability, and forgiveness are far more valuable than wealth. A family built on truth may struggle, but a family built on lies will eventually fall apart.